The Grand Horizon Express thundered through the night, its gleaming carriages cutting through the darkness like a blade through silk. Inside, laughter and crystal glasses clinked under golden chandeliers, oblivious to the danger lurking within. By dawn, one passenger would vanish, another would betray, and the elegant facade of luxury would shatter beneath the weight of a secret so dark that even the dead would whisper its name. Eleanor Hartwick, seated in the shadows, already knew this was not just a journey, this was a trap, and the real game had yet to begin. The Elysian Express stood like a gilded serpent under the dying embers of the sun, its brass fixtures catching the light in a display of opulence fit for monarchs. Porters in crisp uniforms weaved through the platform, their movements precise, yet burdened with urgency, as steam curled from the iron beast, coiling into the evening sky like whispers of secrets yet to be told. Among the throng of Europe's elite, Detective Eleanor Graves stepped onto the platform, her unassuming figure draped in a simple travel-worn coat, an intentional contrast to the peacocks surrounding her. A face that blended effortlessly into crowds, she carried the quiet presence of one who saw much and revealed little. Her eyes, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, swept across the passengers, each a puzzle piece waiting to be placed. Near the baggage car, a man barked orders at a struggling porter, his voice thick with entitlement. Professor Lionel Stroud, a famed historian with a reputation for arrogance, clutched a silver-tipped cane, his fingers adorned with ancient rings rumored to be stolen artifacts. His expression was a mask of irritation, though the twitch in his jaw suggested a deeper anxiety. Just behind him, a woman kept a careful distance. Dr. Vivian Holt, her posture rigid, her gloved hands tightening around a leather satchel as if it contained something far more valuable than mere papers. The tension between them was almost tangible, an unspoken battle simmering beneath their polished exteriors. "Tickets, please," called a steward, jarring Eleanor from her silent deductions. She handed hers over with a composed nod and stepped aboard. Inside, the train was a palace on wheels. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a golden glow, velvet drapes framed the windows like stage curtains, and the scent of aged wood and fresh polish lingered in the air. Her cabin was modest yet refined, its small window offering a glimpse of the platform's dwindling chaos. But even luxury could not mask the undercurrents of secrecy swirling through the corridors. In the Grand Salon car, the atmosphere was a delicate balance of laughter and hushed negotiations, glasses clinking in orchestrated harmony. Eleanor took her seat near the entrance, stirring her tea slowly, watching. To her left, Lord Edgar Whitmore, a silver-haired aristocrat with an ever-present smirk, held court among admirers, his every movement deliberate, his words measured for effect. Across the room, Madame Celeste Duval, draped in midnight blue silk, exuded the effortless poise of a woman who knew the power of silence. As she swept through the car, her gaze locked momentarily on Professor Stroud, and in that fleeting second, something unspoken passed between them, something charged, something dangerous. The train lurched into motion, and with it, the carefully constructed facades began to shift. Conversations became more calculated. Alliances formed in the flicker of a glance. Rivalries sharpened beneath forced pleasantries. The steward passed by with champagne, offering a glass to Dr. Holt, who hesitated before accepting, her fingers trembling just slightly. Eleanor caught the movement, storing it away like a clue in an unsolved puzzle. "Curious, isn't it?" a voice murmured beside her. The conductor stood there, his expression knowing, his posture precise. Every journey, a stage, every passenger, a story. Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles, and every story, a shadow of truth, if one listens carefully. He inclined his head, disappearing into the corridor. She turned back to the room, her mind assembling the pieces. The train had begun its voyage, but within its gilded confines, something darker stirred, a secret, a deception, and perhaps, a crime waiting to unfold. The Elysian Express carved its way through the darkening landscape, a streak of opulence against the encroaching night, its brass fixtures gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Within the Grand Salon car, tension simmered beneath the surface of practiced elegance. Professor Lionel Stroud, the famed archaeologist, relished the attention as he lifted a small ornate wooden box, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. With a theatrical flourish, he flipped the lid, revealing a polished obsidian disc, its surface inscribed with eerie glowing symbols that pulsed under the dim lighting. A hush fell over the gathered passengers, as Stroud's voice rang out, rich with self-importance. "Behold, a relic of unparalleled power, unearthed from the ruins of an empire lost to time. Priceless, unique." His voice dropped to a near whisper, potentially lethal. A murmur rippled through the audience, though Eleanor Graves, seated at the edge of the room, detected more skepticism than awe in their expressions. Across from Stroud, Lord Edgar Whitmore, his wine swirling lazily in a crystal glass, arched a knowing brow. "Dangerous, you say?" His voice dripped with amusement. "How wonderfully melodramatic. Tell me, Professor, does the danger lie in the artifact itself, or in the hands of the man who wields it?" Laughter flickered through the crowd, but Stroud's jaw clenched. "Mock me if you will, Lord Whitmore, but this artifact holds knowledge that could rewrite history. Unlike some," his gaze turned sharp, "I do not spend my time profiting from mere speculation and idle conversations." Whitmore's smirk never wavered, but his grip on the glass tightened. "And unlike some, I value caution over reckless ambition." The air crackled between them, two powerful men circling like rival kings on a chessboard. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze sweeping the room. Dr. Vivian Holt, usually composed, watched the exchange with a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Madame Celeste Duval, wrapped in sapphire silk, exhaled smoke in a slow, deliberate curl, one perfectly arched brow raised in quiet amusement. Tension coiled through the room like an invisible wire. Something was at play here, something deeper than a petty academic rivalry. As the evening wore on, the Elysian Express became quieter, the Grand Salon car, emptying as passengers retired to their compartments. The corridors, once alive with murmured conversation and soft laughter, now carried only the occasional whisper of footsteps, and the steady rhythm of the train slicing through the night. Eleanor moved with deliberate steps, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished wood. Something gnawed at her, an instinct she had long since learned not to ignore. A flicker of movement ahead, a shadow slipping between the towering luggage trunks in the storage car. Eleanor stopped, her breath slow, measured. Whoever it was, they were in a hurry. No call-outs, no unnecessary noise. Silence was an investigator's best ally. She edged forward, brushing her fingers along the cool leather of a steamer trunk, eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The scent of old leather, oil, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. Then, a sound, the rustling of fabric, a hurried shuffle. Someone was here. Watching, waiting, hiding. Her gaze darted to a small folded paper wedged between two cases. Carefully, she pulled it free, unfolding it to reveal a hastily scribbled warning. "Keep your distance or face the consequences." The ink was fresh, the strokes erratic, written in haste. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, a warning, a threat. Either way, it was an invitation. As she turned, a faint metallic click echoed through the car, a latch locking, a case being sealed. Someone was nearby, watching, unseen. The shadow was gone, but the danger remained, lingering like the cold breath of something unseen creeping through the seams of the train. The Elysian Express was no longer merely a luxurious escape for the wealthy. It was a web of secrets, deception and peril. And Eleanor Graves had just stepped into its darkest threads. Her tea sat untouched, its surface cooling to a delicate sheen in the porcelain cup. Eleanor Graves barely acknowledged it, her sharp gaze drifting lazily across the Elysian Express's grand salon, taking in the smallest inconsistencies, the nervous flick of a cufflink, the lingering gaze of a man watching someone he shouldn't. It was a delicate dance of silent cues, a game of veiled intentions, and Eleanor was its unseen puppeteer. She made a mental note of Dr. Vivian Raines's clenched jaw, the way the woman's fingers drummed against the stem of her wine glass in an erratic rhythm. Then, without warning, the train lurched violently. A gasp of alarm rang through the room as glasses tilted, silverware clattered, and the genteel illusion of control shattered in an instant. "Bloody hell!" Lord Whitmore exclaimed, his brandy sloshing perilously close to spilling. "This train is meant to be a marvel of engineering, not a drunken mule cart." The doors swung open to reveal the conductor, his uniform pristine but his composure slightly frayed. "A minor disruption, ladies and gentlemen. A temporary mechanical issue, nothing to be concerned about." The passengers were not so easily convinced. Dr. Raines muttered darkly, adjusting the lace cuffs of her gown. "Temporary indeed. A machine of this caliber should not lurch like that unless—" She hesitated. "Unless something interfered with it." Eleanor caught the flicker of unease that passed through the room like a ghostly ripple. A momentary jolt had peeled back the genteel veneer, exposing frayed nerves and unspoken tensions. But it was not the disturbance itself that intrigued her, it was the reactions. Across the salon, Professor Alistair Wren, the arrogant archaeologist who had paraded his so-called priceless relic earlier, sat stiffly, his fingers tightening around the small, intricately carved wooden box he had refused to part with all evening. His knuckles were bloodless against the dark wood. Interesting. By the time the train resumed its smooth glide, the room had settled, though the easy indulgence of before had cooled to something warrior, more brittle. The dining car, once a temple of elegance, now hummed with an undercurrent of something darker. Eleanor sat at her table, seemingly absorbed in the perfect symmetry of her untouched lemon tart, while the murmur of conversation slowly rebuilt itself around her. She allowed herself to drift into the rhythm of the voices, filtering out the meaningless pleasantries until, "A theft, you say? But how?" Her spoon hovered midair. The hushed exchange came from a table at the far end of the car, where Dr. Evelyn Markham leaned in close to a young steward whose hands trembled as he spoke. I saw it myself," the steward whispered, glancing around as though the very walls might betray him. "It was worth more than this train itself." "Then it must still be here," Markham hissed, her voice laced with something dangerously sharp. "No one could have left without being noticed." Eleanor leaned back, her expression serene, but her mind sharpening like a scalpel. The fragments of the evening, the sudden jolt, Wren's white-knuckled grip on his box, the steward's whispered confession, were beginning to align. But the full picture was still shrouded in shadow. The air in the dining car seemed to shift again as Madame Celeste Renaud swept inside, her perfume trailing in delicate tendrils, her every movement deliberate. She paused for the briefest moment, her gaze passing over the room before settling on Professor Wren. A small knowing smile curled her lips, there and gone in an instant, before she made her way to her own table. Eleanor's intrigue deepened. The weight surrounding Wren and his artifact was growing thicker, more suffocating. What exactly had he brought aboard this train? And who else knew of its worth? The Elysian Express, once a realm of indulgent escape, was slowly transforming into something else entirely, a crucible where secrets collided, where every passenger played a part in a silent high-stakes game. And Eleanor Graves, watchful and unassuming, intended to be the one who saw through it all. The dining car of the Elysian Express shimmered with wealth and whispers, candlelight flickering off diamond necklaces and polished silverware. Eleanor Graves watched the room like a hawk, her delicate fingers resting against the stem of her untouched wineglass. Conversations hummed in orchestrated elegance, until Professor Lucian Harrow rose abruptly from his seat, his voice slicing through the air like a dagger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his tone laced with theatrical arrogance, "I ask for but a moment of your attention, for tonight I offer you a glimpse into history itself." All eyes turned toward him, as he lifted a small ornate wooden box, the same one he had clutched with obsessive reverence earlier. With deliberate care, he unlatched it, revealing a gleaming obsidian disc, its polished surface absorbing the light like a void. A ripple of unease passed through the room. This, Harrow continued, is not a mere relic pulled from the dust of forgotten tombs. It is a key, a conduit to something ancient, something powerful. A scoff cut through the silence. Across the room, Dr. Celeste Marlowe, her piercing gaze unwavering, leaned forward. "And yet you refuse to say exactly what it unlocks," she murmured. "Curious, isn't it?" Harrow's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained composure. "Some knowledge is not freely given, Dr. Marlowe, it is earned, or stolen," she countered, her voice cool but edged with steel. "You flaunt your discovery like a trophy, but we both know the truth, don't we?" Gasps, murmurs, a shift in the air. The room tensed like a drawn bowstring. Eleanor watched closely. Harrow's fingers tightened on the box. "Careful, Celeste," he said, his voice dipping into something darker. "Accusations have consequences, as does theft," she shot back. "That artifact belongs in a museum, not your grasping hands." The tension was a live wire, snapping through the space between them. No one spoke, no one moved, and then the train lurched. Crystal glasses toppled, plates slid, a woman gasped. The Elysian Express, famed for its silk-smooth ride, had stumbled, just for a breath of a moment, but long enough for the illusion of control to shatter. Harrow swayed, gripping the box tightly, as the train settled back into its rhythm. His expression, once smug, had turned wary. Something had changed. Eleanor's fingers curled around the stem of her glass. Not an accident. A warning. The air in the dining car had shifted. The usual warmth of candlelight and perfume was now tinged with something colder, more brittle. When Eleanor returned to her table, she immediately sensed it, a disturbance in the unseen balance. The steward who approached her was pale, his hands trembling as he poured her tea. "Madam," he whispered, voice barely audible over the renewed hum of conversation. "It's Professor Harrow. He's missing." Eleanor set her cup down. "Missing?" The steward swallowed. His cabin door was open, and he hesitated. There was blood, a trail leading toward the luggage car. The world around her dimmed for a fraction of a second. Then she rose. "Take me there." The corridor to Harrow's cabin was eerily still, the soft hum of the train magnifying the silence. When the steward pushed open the door, Eleanor took in the scene with a practiced eye. A struggle had taken place. An overturned chair, a shattered glass, the wooden box gone, and on the carpet, smeared in a small but undeniable streak, was blood. A trail glistening faintly in the dim light led out of the room toward the rear of the train. Eleanor knelt, fingertips grazing the floor. "This was no simple robbery," she murmured. "And if Harrow is alive, he may not be for long." The luggage car was heavy with silence. The scent of leather and polish hung in the air as Eleanor stepped forward, her every movement calculated, her breath steady. The blood trail ended at a steamer trunk, its lid slightly ajar, a deliberate placement, a message. With careful hands she lifted the lid. Inside, nothing but neatly folded clothes. A decoy, Eleanor's mind whirred. If someone had gone through the trouble to mislead, then the true secret, whatever Harrow had uncovered, was still hidden. Somewhere on this train, a whisper of movement behind her. The hair at the nape of her neck rose. She wasn't alone. The Imperium Express thundered through the night, its polished corridors and velvet-draped cabins concealing whispers darker than the midnight sky. Ela Caro, seated in the grand salon, swirled the wine in her glass, watching the room like a panther waiting to pounce. The passengers moved in their usual dance of luxury, subtle glances, measured words, but tonight, something had changed. The illusion of civility had cracked. Somewhere on this train, Professor Alistair Crown had vanished. She had been the first to sense it. The air too still, the conversations once an effortless hum, now fractured and wary. Then confirmation arrived. A pale-faced steward, wringing his hands, voice trembling as he murmured the words that set Isla's pulse thrumming. "Miss Carrow, it's Professor Crown." His cabin door was open, and there was blood. Isla's wineglass barely made a sound as she set it down. "Take me there." The corridor outside cabin number 9 was steeped in an unsettling silence. Lamplight flickered against brass fixtures, casting long distorted shadows. Isla stepped through the open doorway, her sharp gaze dissecting the scene with the precision of a hunter. A struggle had taken place. The overturned chair, the shattered crystal tumbler on the carpet, the wardrobe door, hanging ajar, its expensive suits disheveled as though someone had searched in haste. But it was the writing desk that caught her eye. A single sheet of paper, partially drawn from a drawer, as if desperate to be found. She retrieved it with careful fingers, her breath stilling as she read, "I am not safe. The artifact is not secure. If I disappear, follow the trail. Trust no one." The ink bled slightly at the end, the pen stroke jagged, unfinished. Isla exhaled, slow and steady. Crown had known something, and someone had made sure he wouldn't speak. Behind her the steward shifted nervously. "You were the last to see him," she murmured, not turning. "Yes, Miss Carrow," he stammered. "Last night, before dinner, he said he needed to ensure something was protected." After that, Iron had voices. Raised voices, near the luggage car. He hesitated. "I thought it was just, well, nothing serious." Isla finally looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "On this train, my dear, nothing is ever just anything." The luggage car was a vault of secrets. Shadows pooled between trunks, the scent of polish and leather thick in the air. Isla moved soundlessly, her senses attuned to the smallest details, and then she saw it, a dark smudge on the brass handle of a trunk. Blood. She crouched, fingertips grazing the polished surface. A faint indentation on the carpet beside it, as though something heavy had been dragged. Nearby, a torn scrap of paper, wedged between two cases. She pried it loose, smoothing the creased surface. Crown's handwriting, unmistakable. The disc must remain hidden. Exposure is unthinkable. Suspicions arise. Lyle knows too much. Montrose is no better. No one can be trusted. The sentence cut off in a jagged tear. She pressed a hand against the lid of the trunk, feeling for an irregularity. A soft click. The hidden compartment slid open. Empty. Her pulse remained steady. The absence of the artifact was more damning than its presence. Someone had been here first, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. By the time Isla returned to the Grand Salon, the atmosphere was taut with barely concealed panic. Passengers gathered in hushed circles, their voices fevered, darting glances betraying the undercurrent of fear that had settled over the train like a storm cloud. "It's Montrose," hissed a woman draped in pearls, her fingers gripping the arm of her companion. "He's always been envious of Crown's discoveries." "Nonsense," scoffed a man with a waxed mustache. "It's Lyle. She's the one with connections to the underground collectors. She'd sell the artifact to the highest bidder." Isla stood near Sir Felix Harland, who lounged against the bar with a calculated air of indifference. "This," he remarked idly, "is why I avoid dealing in relics. They attract far too much unpleasantness." Isla's lips curved. "Unpleasantness, Sir Felix? Or opportunity?" His gaze flickered to her, amusement shadowed with something darker. "Opportunity is for the foolish or the desperate, Miss Carrow. I am neither." A lie. She could see it in his eyes, and from the periphery a presence stirred. Lucille Desrosiers, stepping into the candlelight, her sapphire gown shimmering as she watched Isla with an unreadable smile. The game had begun. The Imperium Express surged through the inky night, its lavish interiors now a pressure chamber of secrets and suspicion. In the Grand Salon, the air was thick with unspoken accusations, the weight of uncertainty pressing in like a storm about to break. Isla Carrow, poised near the marble fireplace, let the rising tension wash over her, a faint smile curving her lips. Fear had entered the carriage like a ghost. and it had no intention of leaving. Such accusations are tiresome, murmured Lucille Desrosiers, her voice silk over steel. She exhaled a thin plume of cigarette smoke, her emerald gown catching the flicker of candlelight. If Professor Crown has truly vanished, should we not focus on those with a reason to see him gone? Her dark gaze flicked, deliberate and cutting, toward Dr. Montrose, whose rigid posture suggested a barely controlled temper. I may have loathed the man, Montrose replied icily, but murder is a rather extreme method of academic competition. From a shadowed corner Sir Felix Harland chuckled, swirling the brandy in his glass. Come now, he mused, aren't we all being a touch dramatic? A missing professor does not necessarily mean a crime, and yet, Isla interjected smoothly, you seem curiously eager to dismiss the notion. A hush fell. Isla, watching closely, caught the darting glances, the stiffening shoulders. No one here was untainted. Lies slithered through the room, coiled and waiting to strike. Outside, the countryside blurred past in a ribbon of darkness, the train slicing through it like a silver blade. The further they traveled, the tighter suspicion wrapped around them. The stakes had shifted. Isla could feel it. The game had begun in earnest. By morning the grand salon had lost its warmth. Pale light filtered through lace curtains, bathing the room in a deceptive calm. Across from Isla, Dr. Evelyn Montrose perched stiffly in a high-backed chair, her perfectly tailored suit betraying the tremor in her fingers as she smoothed the hem of her sleeve. Isla sipped her tea, her movements slow, deliberate. This must be quite unsettling for you, Dr. Montrose. The woman's lips pressed into a tight line. Unsettling? That doesn't quite cover it. Professor Crown was insufferable, a fraud masquerading as a scholar. And yet, Isla murmured, setting her cup down, frauds rarely provoke such deep resentment. I imagine sharing a professional sphere with him was exhausting. A flicker of something, a triumph perhaps, flashed across Evelyn's sharp features. Exhausting? Infuriating? Absolutely. He stole my work. Years of research reduced to a mere footnote beneath his name. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. And the artifact? It was never his. He bought it through underhanded means from a dealer no one would dare speak of. But of course he wouldn't admit that, would he? Isla studied her, taking in the tension coiling beneath the academic's polished veneer. An intriguing claim, though even a wronged rival wouldn't necessarily resort to drastic measures. Evelyn bristled. Are you implying? No, Miss Caro, I am many things, but I am not a killer. My dispute with Crown was professional, not personal. Isla let the words settle like dust in a quiet room, watching as the certainty in Evelyn's eyes wavered. The observation car had emptied after breakfast, leaving only the whisper of passing scenery and the distant murmur of the train's wheels against the tracks. Lucille Desrosiers stood near the window, a vision of practiced elegance, her reflection in the glass as composed as a painted portrait. Isla approached, her movements light, calculated. A stunning view, is it not? Lucille's lips quirked in a faint smile. Quite, though I must admit, the company aboard this train is far more intriguing than the landscape. Indeed, Isa murmured, stepping closer. Speaking of company, Madame Desrosiers, I was curious about your association with Professor Crown. A shared appreciation for rare artifacts, perhaps. Lucille took a slow, deliberate drag of her cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the golden morning light. Crown was ambitious, she admitted, a trait I find admirable in moderation, but reckless. She exhaled, her dark eyes unreadable. That, I do not tolerate. His hunger for forbidden relics led him to dangerous waters. Such as Roland Vere. Isola's voice was light, but the question was a knife hidden in silk. Lucille's laughter was soft, deceptively musical, yet utterly devoid of warmth. Vere? She mused. Ah, yes. A name whispered in cautionary tales. A convenient phantom to blame when one wishes to avoid looking in the mirror. Isola tilted her head. Yet you know of him. Lucille's gaze held steady, unblinking. Knowledge is no crime, Miss Caro, But as for actual crimes, she flicked the ash from her cigarette. Perhaps you should be questioning the good professor's other acquaintances. Ambition makes enemies of us all. A silence stretched between them, a battleground where neither would yield. Isla's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of the chase. The truth was here, buried beneath the velvet and gold of the Imperium Express, and she intended to unearth it. The Elysian Express, a train of opulence and whispers, thundered through the night, its carriages bathed in the dim glow of antique lamps. The silence of the journey was shattered by an eerie chime, soft yet deliberate, followed by a muffled gasp that barely rose above the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a distinguished historian, adjusted the crisp folds of her gown, her sharp eyes flickering with unease. This was no ordinary journey, this was a stage, and somewhere in its velvet-draped corridors, a mystery had already begun to unfold. Across from her, Lord Percival Hastings, a shrewd dealer in antiquities, swirled the amber liquid in his glass with an effortless grace, his lips curling into a knowing smile. History, dear lady, is merely a collection of buried secrets waiting for the right hands to unearth them. But Eleanor's mind was elsewhere, on the delicate pink envelope that had been discreetly slipped beneath her teacup moments ago. She unfolded it with practiced precision. Inside, scrawled in hurried, uneven script, were the words, "The shadows are watching, more than you think." A flicker of unease coiled in her stomach. Someone had left this warning deliberately, but who, and more importantly, why? She raised her gaze, scanning the carriage with quiet intensity. The passengers played their parts well, some feigning casual amusement, others wrapped in the illusion of polite indifference. Yet, beneath their elegant facades, something pulsed, a tension, a carefully concealed knowledge. But this night was not merely one of whispered threats. Somewhere aboard this train, hidden among the velvet curtains and polished brass, lay an artifact of immeasurable worth, an artifact that history had a habit of losing, only to resurface in blood-stained hands. Eleanor knew that objects of power did not simply vanish, they were stolen, coveted, killed for, and tonight, the Elysian Express carried more than just passengers, it carried secrets. Her gaze settled on the familiar faces. There was Sir Percival, ever the opportunist, his ambition outpacing his morals. Madame Celeste de Vere, a collector with an uncanny knack for acquiring things that didn't belong to her. And then there was the silent steward, his movements practiced, his expression unreadable, watchful, perhaps too watchful. A quiet resolve settled in Eleanor's bones as she placed her teacup down with deliberate care. Just then, a distant sound shattered the fragile calm, a door slamming shut in the luggage car below. Then the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps, their rhythm frantic. She rose instinctively, slipping from the lavish salon car and into the dimly lit corridors of the train. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and lingering cologne, but beneath it all was something else, something unsettling. The luggage car loomed ahead, its flickering overhead light swaying with the train's motion. And there, amidst the neatly stacked trunks, lay an open chest, its contents missing, save for a single folded coat. Eleanor's fingers brushed the fabric, her pulse quickening as she found what lay hidden inside. A single chilling message awaited her: if you uncover the truth, you will be next. Her breath hitched, but she steadied herself. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against her skin, the presence of something, or someone, lurking just beyond sight. This murderer was no ordinary criminal. They were calculating, patient, watching, and now, they knew that she was watching too. The Elysian Express surged forward through the night, its grandeur masking the unease that had settled among its passengers like an unseen mist. The dining car, usually alive with polite conversation and the clinking of fine china, was eerily subdued, the atmosphere thick with something unspoken. Lady Vivienne Aldridge, a woman of quiet intellect and an eye for deception, stirred her tea with absent precision, her mind elsewhere. Moments ago, a folded note had been discreetly tucked beneath her saucer, and now, in the flickering candlelight, she read its chilling message: "Not everything that is lost wishes to be found." Vivienne's breath steadied, but her fingers betrayed her tension as they traced the elegant script. This was not a mere warning, it was a challenge. Across the car, Lord Sebastian Graves, a financier with an appetite for risk, regarded her with a glance too fleeting to be casual. Was it mere curiosity, or had he seen the note arrive? Beyond the velvet-draped corridors, in the shadows of the luggage car, something shifted, a rustle of fabric, the creak of leather as a hand carefully unlatched a trunk. The dim overhead light flickered, casting jagged silhouettes over the rows of neatly stacked cases. Somewhere in this space, among the relics of travelers' lives, lay something far more valuable, something worth deceiving, stealing, even killing for. Vivienne moved silently, her heart drumming in her chest as she crouched beside an unassuming leather valise. Her gloved fingers worked quickly, finding the hidden clasp beneath its lining. A whisper of metal, a soft click, and there it was, a velvet pouch, tied with a silk cord, heavy in her palm. She loosened the knot, and moonlight through the narrow window revealed a perfect disk of obsidian, its polished surface reflecting her cautious expression. Yet something was wrong. The weight was off, the sheen too precise. A forgery. Her stomach coiled with realization. If this was a fake, then where was the real artifact? And more importantly, who else knew? A sudden noise, footsteps, quick and deliberate. Vivienne straightened, her mind calculating her next move. A shadow moved between the trunks, its owner hidden in the dimness. The attack came without warning, an arm lunging from the darkness, fingers outstretched to seize her, but she was faster. A swift sidestep, a sharp turn, and her would-be assailant lost their balance, stumbling against the hard edge of a crate. The sound of hurried retreat echoed down the carriage as the figure vanished into the night. Vivienne exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Someone else was after the truth, and now they knew she was looking for it too. The train thundered forward, and somewhere within its corridors the game was only just beginning. The Elysian Express hummed through the darkened landscape, its lavish interiors now carrying an unmistakable weight of dread. Lady Vivienne Aldridge entered the dimly lit lounge, her expression composed, but her mind a whirlwind of calculations. Across the room, Lord Sebastian Graves lounged in an armchair, his fingers absently swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Another disappearance," Vivienne remarked, her voice light, yet edged with meaning. "At this rate, one wonders if the staff will survive the journey." Graves smirked, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Perhaps we should disembark at the next station and spare ourselves the theatrics." Vivienne studied him. His composure was remarkable, too remarkable. "And yet you remain unshaken, Lord Graves," she observed. "A trait of experience, I presume." He exhaled slowly, lifting his glass. "Experience teaches restraint, Miss Aldridge. It also teaches the value of keeping certain truths undisclosed." "A fine philosophy," she said, inclining her head. "Though one must recognize the difference between wisdom and evasion." His gaze held hers for the briefest second before he took a measured sip of brandy, his silence more telling than words. Elsewhere in the train, within the velvet-draped confines of Madame Lisette Moreau's private cabin, the scent of jasmine lingered. Reclining against silk cushions, the famed socialite-turned-collector traced a delicate hand over the stem of a half-empty glass, her sapphire gown shimmering like liquid dusk. A knock at the door interrupted the silence, and as Vivienne entered, Madame Moreau's crimson lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, Miss Aldridge. To what do I owe the pleasure? Another scandal, I assume." "Not quite," Vivienne replied smoothly, producing a neatly folded parchment from her pocket. I happened upon something intriguing. She unfolded the aged map with practiced care. This was found among the late Dr. Harrington's effects, a layout of his excavation site, annotated in a rather distinctive hand. Moreau's gaze flickered. "And you assume it concerns me?" Vivienne tapped a manicured finger against the bottom corner of the map, where two small initials had been inscribed alongside a date, one that predated Harrington's claim to the artifact. "I assume nothing, madame. I merely find it curious." Moreau's fingers tightened around her glass, her practiced grace slipping just enough for Vivienne to notice. "Coincidence, I assure you," she murmured. Perhaps Vivienne conceded, though I have always found that coincidences aboard this train are seldom innocent. A small exhale too sharp to be casual. Then, in a voice laced with meaning, Moreau whispered, "You are clever, Miss Aldridge, but tread carefully. Some doors once opened cannot be closed." Vivienne smiled, but the warning lodged in her mind like a splinter. As she departed, the walls of the Elysian Express seemed to close in, heavy with whispers and unseen eyes. The Grand Salon car was unusually still, the tension within its polished wood and golden embellishments more suffocating than the thick velvet drapes. Dr. Evelyn Montclair approached, her poised demeanor marred by something rare, uncertainty. She hesitated before speaking, her voice a whisper of urgency. "Miss Aldridge, we need to talk." Vivienne gestured toward the seat across from her, the flickering candlelight casting shifting shadows between them. "Of course, doctor. What troubles you?" Montclair's hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. "I have not been entirely forthcoming about my past with Dr. Harrington, but given recent events, I fear silence is no longer an option." Vivienne remained unreadable, though her mind sharpened. "And you believe this revelation may untangle some of the mysteries aboard this train?" Montclair exhaled, lowering her voice. "Harrington was reckless. A fraud, yes, but also desperate. He made deals, dangerous ones, and one name came up more than once: Roland Vasseur." Vivienne's expression didn't change, but her thoughts reeled. "And you believe these dealings led to his disappearance?" Montclair nodded, her voice tight. "Absolutely, and though I had my professional differences with Harrington, I never wished him harm, but now I fear that what he uncovered may cost us all far more than our reputations." Outside the compartment, beyond the gleaming corridors of the Elysian Express, the darkened night stretched endlessly, indifferent to the secrets unraveling within. And as the train hurtled forward, so too did the inescapable truth. Something was coming, something inevitable. As the Elysian Express thundered through the night, Vivienne Aldridge considered Dr. Montclair's revelations carefully, measuring sincerity against the bitterness lurking beneath her words. "Justice," Vivienne murmured, turning the concept over like a well-worn coin. "A noble pursuit, certainly, though I have often found that the path to it is rarely as clear as we might hope." Montclair's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Later that afternoon, Vivienne made her way toward the luggage car, her mind churning. The narrow corridor seemed quieter than usual, the heavy hush amplifying the rhythmic clatter of the train over the tracks. As she stepped inside, the scent of aged leather, engine grease, and polish mingled in the confined air. She moved carefully between the trunks and cases, her gaze sweeping over the disorder. A single suitcase sat half open, its contents spilling just enough to suggest carelessness, or perhaps something more deliberate. Lowering herself onto one knee, she reached for the case, her gloved fingers brushing aside layers of folded garments and ordinary personal effects, until they found something less ordinary. A small leather-bound journal, its edges softened by frequent handling. The name inside the cover sent a ripple of interest through her: A. Vasseur. Flipping through its delicate pages, Vivienne's pulse quickened. Line after line detailed financial transactions, illicit shipments, the quiet transfer of artifacts, coded references to buyers across Europe. And then a passage that chilled her. Harrington insists on keeping the disc. Too dangerous to move now. If things go awry, Dubois remains the only viable option. Vivienne's fingers lingered over the ink, her thoughts tightening like a noose. Harrington, Vasseur, Dubois, their connections were no longer circumstantial, but the threads remained maddeningly tangled. What was this disc? Why was it dangerous? And most crucially, who was willing to kill for it? As night descended, the Elysian Express transformed. The once gilded corridors now seemed constricting, the flickering sconces casting elongated shadows, distorting the grand luxury into something more sinister. Inside her cabin, Vivienne spread her findings across the small table: Montclair's claims, the journal, the counterfeit artifact she had discovered earlier. A puzzle was forming, though its final image remained obscured. Madame Dubois, with all her grace and charm, was not merely an elegant collector. Her ties to Vasseur were undeniable. But whether Harrington had been a victim, or an accomplice to his own destruction, was less certain. A knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Montclair at the door, her expression drawn yet resolute. Without invitation, she stepped inside, her urgency apparent. "Tell me, Miss Aldridge," she said, her voice low. "Do you believe me? About Vasseur? About Dubois? Do you think they're behind all this?" Vivienne studied her, her mind weighing possibilities with ruthless precision. "I believe there is truth in what you say, Doctor," she replied at last. "But I have also learned that truth is rarely pure, and never simple." Montclair's frown deepened. "So what do we do now?" Vivienne's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "We wait, my dear. The truth has a way of revealing itself, though sometimes it requires a little persuasion." Montclair hesitated, then nodded, departing without another word. Vivienne turned her gaze back to the journal, running her fingers lightly over its fragile spine. The shadows aboard the Elysian Express were growing darker, stretching hungrily, and she knew, without doubt, that they would soon claim another soul. By the time the Grand Salon car filled once more, the tension had thickened into something nearly tangible. The air was heavy with unspoken fears, the hush pressing against the passengers like an unseen hand. At the center of it all stood Vivienne, poised, composed, her presence commanding in its quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice measured yet cutting through the stillness like a blade. "We are all aware that the disappearance of Dr. Harrington, and now, a steward, has cast an ominous shadow over this journey. However, shadows once examined closely, often reveal more than they conceal." All eyes fixed upon her, including those of Madame Dubois, whose impeccable elegance now seemed almost calculated. Vivienne's gaze sharpened, unrelenting. "Madame Dubois, I wonder if you might enlighten us about your relationship with a certain Roland Vasseur." A ripple of murmurs spread through the car. Dubois raised an arched brow, exhaling slowly as she adjusted the cigarette holder between her gloved fingers. "Miss Aldridge," she said, her tones smooth as silk, "I do not deny knowing Monsieur Vasseur. My work, after all, often places me in the company of fascinating individuals. But to imply anything beyond that is—" Vivienne took a deliberate step forward, cutting through the smokescreen of words before it could thicken. "Imply?" she echoed, her lips curving slightly. "Madame, I rarely deal in implications, I deal in facts. And the facts, I'm afraid, are about to catch up with you." Dubois' fingers tensed ever so slightly around the stem of her cigarette holder, a small motion, but in that moment it was everything. The trap had been set, and soon the truth, however twisted, would surface. The Elysian Express surged forward into the night, its wheels screaming against the tracks, as if the very machine knew it was barreling towards something inescapable. A dense fog curled around the edges of the Midnight Belle as it rumbled through the desolate countryside, its steel frame a shadowy serpent slicing through the night. Inside, the dimly lit compartments buzzed with the quiet murmur of passengers, each carrying secrets heavier than their luggage. Among them sat Eleanor Vance, her piercing gaze studying the reflection in the window, a woman of quiet intelligence, her posture poised but her fingers subtly tense. She had boarded the train under the pretense of leisure, but her true purpose lay in the whispers of a vanished antiquities dealer, a ledger of illicit trades, and a name that surfaced too often to be coincidence. Laurent Dumouriez. The air carried the scent of polished wood and distant cologne as Eleanor made her way toward the rear luggage car, the rhythmic clatter of the train masking her deliberate footsteps. There, amid suitcases stacked like silent sentinels, she found a trunk left ajar, its contents spilling in careless disarray. A flicker of unease brushed against her skin as she sifted through silk scarves and crumpled papers, her breath hitching at the sight of a thick envelope marked with Dumouriez's seal. Within its folds lay a map hand-drawn, its ink smudged at the edges, charting a path not of landscapes, but of smuggled artifacts. And beneath it scrawled in hurried script, "Too dangerous to move, final stop, midnight." A shiver raced down Eleanor's spine. Before she could process the implications, a sound behind her made her freeze, a shift in the air, the unmistakable presence of another. A blade gleamed for the briefest second before she threw herself sideways, toppling into the suitcases as her assailant lunged. Darkness and movement blurred together in a violent struggle, her pulse hammering as she caught sight of a shadowed figure, tall, precise, utterly methodical. Eleanor twisted free just as the train lurched, sending them both sprawling, but before she could catch her attacker's face, they vanished into the maze of compartments, leaving only the scent of damp wool and something metallic in their wake. Heart pounding, she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The midnight bell had become a chessboard of deception, and she was caught between the players. As she clutched the map tighter, a single thought crystallized in her mind. If the final stop was midnight, then she had mere hours before this train delivered more than just passengers. It would deliver death. The midnight zephyr thundered through the vast moonlit countryside, its rhythmic clatter masking the undercurrents of deception that swirled through its gilded halls. Inside, among the finely dressed passengers, Evelyn Harcourt sat in quiet contemplation, her fingers brushing the worn leather of a small unassuming journal. It had not been hers to find, yet there it was, tucked carelessly beneath the velvet seat cushion of the observation car, its pages whispering secrets meant to remain buried. The entries spoke of transactions, artifacts exchanged in the dead of night, names of buyers and sellers concealed in cryptic shorthand. But one name emerged too often to be mere coincidence: Victor Alden, a collector, a scholar, or something far more insidious. Evelyn's mind worked swiftly, aligning the pieces. Alden had boarded this train in Istanbul, his baggage heavier than mere clothing. Rumors followed him, whispers of lost relics and vanished scholars. And now, the journal, a link between him and something sinister. Her pulse quickened as she rose, slipping the journal into her coat pocket, moving with practiced ease toward the rear of the train. The baggage car loomed ahead, its doors left slightly ajar. Inside, the scent of aged leather and oiled metal filled the air, mingling with something else, something faintly acrid, like old parchment singed at the edges. A crate stood half open, straw spilling onto the floor. Within, beneath layers of cloth, gleamed a disk of intricate carvings, its surface pulsing with an eerie iridescence beneath the dim electric lights. Not a mere artifact, a relic of power. A sound behind her, a shift in the air. She turned just as a figure lunged from the shadows, a blade flashing toward her throat. Evelyn twisted narrowly, dodging the strike, her back slamming against a stack of trunks. Her attacker, cloaked in darkness, moved with lethal precision. No words, no hesitation. This was not a warning, it was an execution. She reached blindly, her fingers closing around a heavy brass lamp, swinging it upward with all her strength. The impact sent the figure reeling, a muffled curse escaping their lips before they vanished into the maze of compartments. Panting, Evelyn steadied herself, gripping the edge of the open crate. The train thundered on, the darkness outside stretching endlessly into the unknown. The journal in her pocket burned with unspoken truths, the disc gleamed with unanswered questions, and somewhere in the car ahead, Victor Alden remained seated, unaware, or perhaps entirely prepared. She had hours left before the final stop, before the inevitable reckoning, and as she straightened, her resolve hardened. The hunt had begun. The Obsidian Express carved its way through the perilous mountain pass, its iron wheels shrieking against the tracks as the wind howled through the ravines. Inside, the air was thick with an unspoken tension, each passenger acutely aware that danger lurked in the shadows. Eleanor Graves, her sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit observation car, knew time was slipping away. A single mistake, a misstep in judgment, and the entire train would be lost to the abyss. She traced her fingers over the edge of an unassuming velvet pouch resting in her lap, the decoy. The true artifact, an ancient obsidian relic, etched with forgotten symbols, had been hidden elsewhere. The thief, the saboteur, the killer, they were among them waiting for the moment to strike. A sudden flicker in the overhead lamps sent ripples of unease through the car. Outside, the mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged peaks illuminated only by the cold silver glow of the moon. Eleanor turned her attention to the gathered passengers, each one a potential traitor. The elegant Madame Rousseau, her gloved hands folded with an air of feigned detachment. The brooding Lord Whitaker, his whiskey glass untouched. The meek steward, Everett, whose nervous energy betrayed him. And then there was Victor Blackwell, the financier, the collector, the man who always seemed to know more than he let on. Eleanor rose, her voice cutting through the thick silence. We are hurtling toward catastrophe, ladies and gentlemen. This train has become a battlefield of deception, and if we do not act swiftly, none of us will survive the night. A murmur of protest, a shifting of bodies. But she pressed on. The relic in my possession is what our enemy seeks, and I intend to make them come for it, on my terms. Victor's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. A dangerous game, Miss Graves, but do you even know the players? Before she could answer, the train lurched violently, sending glasses shattering to the floor. A deafening explosion rocked the rear car, and the shrill wail of metal tearing apart split the night. Screams, chaos. The saboteur had made their move. Eleanor fought for balance, her heart hammering as she pushed through the panicked crowd, her focus locked on one goal, the engine. If the brakes had been sabotaged, they had minutes. At best, she reached the corridor just as a shadow detached from the darkness. A figure lunged, a knife glinting in the dim light. Eleanor twisted, barely avoiding the blade as she slammed into the wooden paneling. Her attacker struck again, precise, unrelenting, but she was faster. A well-aimed strike to the ribs sent them staggering, and in that fleeting moment, she saw their face, Everett, the nervous, unassuming steward. You don't understand, he gasped, blood staining his uniform. They will kill us all. This was never about the artifact. It's about silencing those who know too much. Realization crashed over Eleanor. This wasn't just a theft, it was an execution. A secret so dangerous, so damning, that its keepers would rather send the entire train into the abyss than let it be exposed. She had been a step behind, but now she knew the truth. The Obsidian Express thundered toward its fate now resting in Eleanor's hands. The storm raged against the iron beast, as the Obsidian Express carved a treacherous path through the ice-laden mountain pass, its wheels shrieking against the frozen rails. Inside, a hush of fear blanketed the passengers, their gazes shifting nervously as the weight of unseen danger pressed in on them. At the heart of it all, Eleanor Graves stood unwavering in the Grand Salon, the amber glow of the carriage lights flickering over her composed face. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice cutting through the thick silence, we are not merely travelers on this train, we are players in a game far deadlier than any of us imagined. Her sharp eyes swept the room, lingering on the aristocratic Lord Whitaker, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his untouched glass, on the enigmatic Madame Rousseau, her veil concealing a knowing smirk, and lastly, on the ever-dutiful steward, Everett, whose trembling hands clutched the edge of a silver tray too tightly. The disappearances, the threats, the calculated sabotage, none of them are accidents, Eleanor continued, stepping forward, her presence commanding. The one responsible is here among us, manipulating the pieces like a master tactician, ensuring that when the final move is played, they alone stand victorious. A ripple of unease spread through the car, gasps exchanged in hurried whispers. Madame Rousseau scoffed lightly, leaning back against the plush seat. Do entertain us with your conclusion, Miss Graves, since you so adore theatrics. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Very well, the culprit is none other than you, Madame Rousseau. The air in the cabin thickened as all eyes snapped toward her, yet the woman's expression barely wavered. A bold accusation, she said smoothly, though a slight edge had crept into her voice. And your proof? Eleanor held up a tattered journal, its pages yellowed with time. This was found in the quarters of the late Professor Armitage. It details clandestine meetings, coded messages, and one name appearing far too often, yours. A slow exhale left Rousseau's lips, but she did not deny it. Instead she merely tilted her head. Fascinating. But that does not prove I had anything to do with the sabotage of this train. Eleanor's smile never wavered. No, but this does. She nodded to the conductor, who stepped forward, revealing a small mechanical device, its intricate wiring exposed, its silent countdown evident. We found this hidden beneath your seat, he said grimly. For the first time, true panic flashed in Rousseau's eyes. You don't understand, she hissed. If I fail, I am dead regardless. Perhaps, Eleanor conceded, but if you continue down this path, you won't be the only one. The train shuddered violently, the screech of metal tearing through the night, as it hurtled toward its doom. Rousseau's breath came fast, her eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Eleanor saw it a moment before she acted. Don't, but it was too late. Rousseau lunged, shoving past the conductor, her fingers grasping for the detonator. The world slowed. Eleanor surged forward, the weight of fate pressing against her, as she intercepted the woman, their bodies colliding in a tangle of desperation. The device tumbled from Rousseau's grasp, clattering to the floor. Its silent countdown reached its end, and then nothing. The room held its breath. The mechanism had failed. Rousseau collapsed against the seat, her body trembling with something between relief and despair. It was never meant to explode, Eleanor said softly, realization dawning. It was meant to be a message, a warning. The train's whistle howled through the storm, but inside, the silence was deafening. Rousseau looked up at Eleanor with tired eyes. You've doomed us all, but Eleanor merely shook her head. No, the game isn't over yet, and I never lose. The Celestial Express slithered through the treacherous mountain pass, its wheels shrieking against the icy rails, as a storm gathered in the abyss below. Eleanor Graves, her gloved fingers tightening around the fragile counterfeit artifact, felt the weight of the inevitable confrontation pressing down. The killer had played their hand too well, disappearances masked as accidents, a calculated chain of misdirection that had left the passengers paralyzed in fear. But now, the game would end. The Grand Salon car was eerily silent, the soft glow of the chandeliers failing to dispel the thick fog of unease. We have been led to believe this is a tale of greed, Eleanor spoke, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. But what if it was never about the artifact at all? The room bristled, uneasy glances exchanged, but one pair of eyes, cold, measured, gave away a flicker of recognition. You suspect me, Miss Graves? Sir Lawrence Whitmore, the charming financier with an impeccable reputation, exhaled slowly, feigning amusement. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I suspect only those who are too careful to make mistakes. Her fingers brushed the journal in front of her, a ledger of deception, revealing a truth more sinister than a mere heist. The artifact was a ruse, a diversion from something far more valuable smuggled aboard. A fortune not of gold, but of names, documents that could unmask a sprawling web of political espionage. And Whitmore, the ever-gracious patron, was its puppet master. The realization rippled through the passengers, but before a word could be spoken, the lights flickered, the train shuddered, a calculated act of sabotage. The explosion rocked the corridor, sending a tremor through the floorboards. Eleanor lunged, tackling Whitmore as he reached for the hidden revolver beneath his coat. A shot rang out, shattering the ornate mirror behind them, and in the chaos, the secret dossier slipped from his grasp. He was caught, ensnared in the very web he had spun, and as the train hurtled toward its final destination, the storm outside mirrored the tempests of betrayal that had unfolded within its steel walls. Eleanor, bruised but victorious, exhaled, watching as the conductor secured the traitor in irons. But even as justice was served, she knew secrets never truly die. They only find new passengers to haunt. The Grand Horizon Express pulled into the station beneath a bruised sky, its steel form glistening with the remnants of the storm that had chased it through the night. The once pristine carriages, adorned with gold filigree and plush velvet, now bore the weight of secrets too heavy to be left behind. The scent of damp wood, iron and lingering cigar smoke clung to the air, mingling with the quiet murmurs of disembarking passengers, some weary, some relieved, and others carrying the invisible burden of things unsaid. At the edge of the platform, Eleanor Hartwick stood motionless, the final thread of the mystery tangled between her fingers. The note slipped into her bag without her knowledge, was no mere afterthought, it was a challenge. The ink was still fresh, the words deliberate, the truth is never singular. Her gloved fingers tightened around the paper. The words sent a slow, icy pulse through her veins. Justice, she knew, was rarely as clean as the closing of a case. Baroness Lucille DeVoe, the enigmatic art patron, had played her role well. A web of deceit, woven with precision, each thread leading back to her, a perfect villain too perfect. Her desperate final act, the sabotage, the near disaster, the carefully orchestrated destruction, had been stopped with mere moments to spare. But Eleanor had felt it even then, in the final moments before DeVoe was taken away, the silence of a loose end left untied. Beyond the warm glow of the gaslit platform, a shadow moved, not hurriedly, not nervously, but with intent. Detached from the crowd, it lingered just outside the reach of the station's flickering lanterns. Eleanor didn't need to see his face to know. The real puppet master had never been on the train. He had been watching from the outside, guiding each move, ensuring DeVoe's fall while he remained untouched. A thrill, sharp, dark, intoxicating, coursed through her. The city beyond stretched into the night, its towering spires and labyrinthine alleys whispering of secrets buried beneath cobblestones slick with rain. This was no ending, this was an invitation. With a final glance at the Grand Horizon, now silent and still, Eleanor tucked the note into her coat and stepped forward, not away from the mystery, but toward it. Because the Grand Horizon had reached its final stop, but the game had only just begun.